And good evening. Welcome to the Old School podcast about the education system, the educational issues surrounding that system, idiosyncrasies. My name is Ross Miller, and here with Dr. Stephen Bourgeois, both of us equipped with a massive intellect and an adult beverage. And so, how you doing here, Dr. Bourgeois?
I'm not going to admit to the adult beverage, first of all. You're leading me astray. I'm fine. I like Sunday nights. It's probably the most relaxed evening of the week, I think.
Well, I have a problem though. So my problem is, and I was reluctant to make this a big of an issue because it centered on my lovely bride. And given that today is Mother's Day, I was reluctant to kind of get too deep into the weeds. But she told me that there is a discernible difference in the taste between green bell peppers and the other colored bell peppers.
You're talking about red and yellow.
Yes, they all taste the same. Do you detect a difference?
I detect a difference in my reaction to them. If I eat a green one, I have a reaction. The other two, I don't.
Well, you're talking about like allergic?
No, it's beyond the scope of our podcast, that reaction. But I don't know. I think that the green tastes a little bit more acidic. I could be totally wrong. What do I know?
You could be. Yes. What do you know? I was thinking that because you are one who is fond of Totino's pizza.
Totino's?
Which isn't bad when you're like 18. You're like, what are you, like 73 now? And you still favor Totino's pizza.
I'm not 73, but I love Totino's. I don't know why we're even talking about this.
I just had this thing is on my mind.
The red pepper.
It's the pepper thing.
It's best if you have one of each type, and then mix it with some onions and then you're set.
All right. Fine. What are we talking about today here, Dr. Bourgeois?
Well, we're not talking about peppers or onions or any of that.
The effects therein.
No. It seems like you had a topic a few minutes ago and I totally forgot it. So that's how enlightening it is. You tell me.
Well, you and I came together the first time as part of a charter school experience. A charter school that centered on project-based learning. And we have talked before about the differences, the different models, the different things out there that could be used for students to get more out of their educational experience. And I'm curious as to what did you know about project-based learning prior to that stint that we had at that school? And then what do you think of it now?
Well, at that point, I wasn't reading a lot about educational theory, educational history. I did come across John Dewey, and I think he wrote something called the Project Method or something like that.
Right.
I had nothing against it, before I started it. I mean, there are definitely some limitations to it, and I know we'll get into that. But I always thought of a project as something that you did to amplify a lesson, something you did after you learned the material, but not. So it's intriguing, say, well, the project is the curriculum. It's not something you put on top of it or do after. So in theory, I like the idea because it's a different approach to the model where the teacher lectures and gives information. The students take notes and take tests. And so it did appeal to me in a lot of ways. It seemed kind of interesting.
And you do see it in other areas, the notion of, and these, and to some degree, this is older thinking, but the idea that you teach a person to swim by throwing them in the water, where there's no preset to, okay, we're going to put you in the water. This is what we want you to do, but rather you learn by doing, or, fixing a car, if you're going to learn how to change out an alternator or whatever the case may be, the best way of learning how to do it is simply do it. So it's not like that idea of project-based instruction was novel, but it is not something that is widespread. after your experience at the school, what were you kind of left with? Let's talking about the idea of advantages and disadvantages of it. I'd like to, I'll follow up by some of my observations, but I'm kind of curious as to what you walked away from that experience with.
It seemed like there were some areas, some disciplines that totally lent themselves to projects. I'm thinking of things that have labs, like science, for example, obviously engineering and things like that. But I felt like it could be imposed on other subjects, and it felt awkward. It felt like it was all about the structure and the process, not necessarily about the learning.
Hmm.
And we both have pretty strong opinions on rubrics. When you take the idea of a project and you add a pretty strict grading system that's numeric, and you have these categories of grades, it's you something happens to the project itself where every student in the class presents something that's relatively the same, and that's what I saw for 4 or 5 years is projects that weren't as individualized as I would have liked to see, and also a lot of forcing the methodology on subjects that didn't necessarily fit.
So prior to our shared experience, I didn't know a lot about it, and I was not like you. I had not done a lot of deep dives into education prior to my entryway into the field. I kind of came into it like, well, this is what it's supposed to be, and so I kind of just rolled with it. And it was not until I got to that point in my career where I started thinking, is this the best way? Are there other ways that we could possibly do this? And looking back on it in retrospect, I have the concurring attitude that perhaps there are some subjects that are better suited for this model compared to others. But I'm wondering if it's just because you and I were trained in a certain way within our disciplines, and that is the only methodology that we have seen used as far as our subject matter goes. And perhaps there is a way of doing it, and we just didn't understand it, or we just didn't know it. I think this is going to be the first of a couple things we're going to talk about with regards to project-based learning. But I'm wondering how much of it is that it's an ill-fitted part, or it's just something that was so new that we just couldn't wrap our head around it.
I think we came to it relatively late in our careers, and so we had already solidified a methodology, and I went through several, teaching German, and eventually I had something that worked, and I did a lot of things that didn't work over the years, but that was already set. And I think in your case, you also had a system for teaching history that was tried and true. So coming up with the idea of applying something like that, there's something that you can tell if something's working when you mention to the students, okay, we're going to do a project, and just listen. Is it excitement? Is it a sigh? I heard a lot of sighs, and I think the longer students are doing that, because they realize, okay, before we get too far into this conversation, we're going to be talking about a rubric. We're going to be talking about grading. And so in a way, the project idea is pretty good, but how do you assess it? That seems to be where it falls short.
We've talked about rubrics before, and you brought up, the fact that we both have issues with them, primarily because they are restrictive in nature. They are restrictive not just of the educational process, but the exploration of whatever idea you profess to want to measure.
Yeah. And
so what you end up getting is you get kind of a standardization, kind of like a McDonald's assembly line of hamburgers, if you'll pardon the rather lack of Epicurean references there. But the idea is that what you're getting is you're getting a kind of a cookie cutter model, and you're not getting ingenuity, you're not getting creativity, you're not getting exploration. you're getting a formulaic, almost bureaucratic following of a set of guidelines.
Well, in some ways, the act of the project felt unnatural. There was a tendency for them to be groups, and miraculously, almost every group had 4 people.
Right.
So there are these, and then assign each group member a role or something like that. The worry would be that the benefit of the method would be to maybe 1 or 2 people in a group because they do most of the work.
Mm.
But I don't think it was equitable as far as the effort from student to student. And they tended to play that to their strength. So if somebody was good at technology, they would be making videos, but not learning history, for example. Right. So there were some holes. I definitely think there were some holes. But I will say that the general idea of it, of applying something, I really do support. But it comes down to execution, and I will say that the better projects took a lot of preparation, and it's very different than traditional teaching because there's a lot more work on the front end. And then the assessment is kind of you stand and watch kids stand up and give a PowerPoint presentation. And so the work is on the front end, and I don't know if it is the most efficient way to use that time, because that time is precious.
So there's one element of this, and that is the idea of how do you assess a project as a potential flaw in the system. But you've referred to now a couple of times to an additional flaw, and that is the student. Now, in a traditional high school setting, you have a group project of 4 people. You've got the kid who's going to work. You have who is kind of a de facto leader. You'll have the kid who will mainly do what the de facto leader says. You'll have the goofball who provides comic relief throughout the entire process. And then you have the kid who's not really terribly interested in any of this. He's just hoping he can ride the coattails of the other 3 and get himself a decent grade, whereas otherwise he wouldn't, or she wouldn't. And so that's how it tends to break down. And you mentioned this to a classroom of high schoolers right now, and they'll say, oh yeah, there you go. Because they know how this works. They know how the system operates. And so do you think that it is not also a case that a system like this can work, but it requires a very selective process of the kind of student that you want as a part of the system? Or is it something that could potentially apply across the board?
It's really difficult to answer, particularly in public school where you don't get to choose your clientele.
Right.
But I have an example actually at the doctoral level.
Let's hear it.
When I was every once in a while, there's a standard way that a doctoral course works. It's a seminar, but the professor presents some material, but then for the most part, individual students will present, and they'll do their presentation and they'll have discussion. That's how it's done. That's how it's always been done. But once in a while, the idea comes to a professor, let's have a group project and a group paper. And so the dynamic is very similar to that high school that we talked about. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine I was in that situation, and I eventually became an editor, a writer, and so forth. I ended up, writing most of that paper, but trying to make it look like there was collaboration when the collaboration wasn't really working, and lots of personal things happened. It was challenging, and maybe the professor had that in mind. You learn to work with difficult people, but I don't think so. Mm-hmm. So still, one person or maybe 2 end up doing all the work. I always dreaded it, so when I'd walk into a new class, I'd look at the syllabus and say, oh, good, there's no group work. So group work and projects kind of go hand in hand. And it's unfortunate, but I think it's difficult to conceive of a individual project because the presentation of the results would take so much time. Instead of listening to 10 presentations, you listen to 30. So it's not as efficient for the presentation side also.
And the presentation side is the other side of the equation where students can, or perhaps the wrong kind of student could cause issues, because, the problem that we had and the problem that I have had over the course of my career is a group's proclivities towards trying to be funny. And so this lack of seriousness as to what they're doing seems to be on its face for some folks, some students, to be antithetical to how they want to approach things. They want to approach things funny. They want to approach things sarcastically. They want to approach things sardonically. And the problem is that attitude presupposes already a knowledge of everything associated with this, and they have felt it's necessary to be sarcastic about it. So, do you not see this as a kind of an additional problem? Beyond the fact that you have 4 kids standing up in front of a PowerPoint, basically reading it verbatim, which is not interesting to anyone for any reason.
I've seen quite a few of those where they're standing in an awkward line and they walk up one after the other. Tell me what your question was again. Something you said there I want to respond to, and I've forgotten.
Just the idea about, how do you address the fact that there is this tendency by students to treat this as a venue or a vehicle to be funny, to be sarcastic, to be to kind of approach the subject as if in and of itself is not important?
Yeah, I think that there's a tendency of high school students, no matter what, to try to minimize the expectations. And so they don't want this to be a serious procedure where they're all working hard and pressing to learn and overcome challenges. So that attitude minimizes it, not necessarily with the assignment from the teacher, but what their expectations are in that group. And so it comes down and it becomes less stressful. So they're fighting a couple things. They're fighting stress and also embarrassment. And so that's you were like that as a kid, right?
Sure.
You were a comedian, probably a really good one.
But that is very.
But I could see that dynamic, and way back when I was in high school, I would have been the one who just would kind of put my head down and try not to be embarrassed.
Right.
I'd work if I was asked to work, but I definitely wouldn't lead anything.
What's the John Cleese joke that the average Englishman goes through their life just hoping and praying not to be embarrassed or humiliated?
That's a project. That's when you go into a project as well.
But the other thing about it is that you mentioned something about the idea of lowering the expectation and doing so in such a way. I tried to broach this subject with the students. I said, listen, before we do this project, and it would be the only one we do the entire year, but it seemed like the quickest way to get through something that I wanted to hit, but I didn't want to spend a lot of time with, and so I kind of devised this other means. But you tell students that, listen, you guys are experts on bad lesson plans. You are experts on bad presentations of lessons. You've seen the best and you've seen the worst. You know what it looks like. So when you get together with your group and you're sitting here trying to devise a way of presenting this information to the rest of the class, keep that in mind. Be interesting, be engaging. Find a way to try to rope your fellow students into this. And when you do that, the problem is you are placing that pressure on them to take it seriously, to work hard, and to be able to present information to a degree that they can field questions, they can entertain theories or speculations from the class or what have you. And they're just not equipped for that. And it's something where it's you either have to say, we're never going to do a project again, or we have to do more because kids need to be able to figure out how to operate under these kind of conditions.
There's a saying, it wasn't our organization, but another project-based charter school that had this, what I thought was a terrible slogan. And it was, it's not what you know. It's not what you know. It's what you can show. which kind of goes. It's a reversal of what we would want. But it's all about the presentation of embedding technology and having it look good, and everybody dresses up. Wears a suit, which really looks weird in high school. These kids walking around in a suit.
Right.
Oh, you're doing a presentation,
Yeah.
So
the bad part about that is you see it. Well, you saw it in 1960. 1960, for those of you who don't know or weren't alive, I wasn't, but I do remember. I'm a history teacher. But in 1960, they had the very first televised presidential debate. And prior to that, I think there had been conversations, but it was done simply on radio. But this is going to be the first time they're going to televise it. And you have Senator Kennedy from Massachusetts, who's looking dapper, tanned. He's got a modicum of makeup applied to sit underneath those very hot, very oppressive television lights. Then you have Richard Nixon, congressman from California, former vice president of the United States under Dwight D. Eisenhower. He does not have that experience under the lens of public attention. He did not grow up famous and rich. He grew up the child of migrant farm workers, and he had no experience. Even as vice president, no one really paid attention to him. He wasn't sitting down for interviews on a regular basis. He was just a guy filling that role. And the famous, and a lot of speech classes talk about this, the people who saw the debate felt Kennedy had won, but people who had heard the debate felt that Nixon won. What does that mean? Well, it could mean a couple of things. It could mean that Kennedy was better for show than for no, the idea that, he looked better than he possessed information and knowledge about the job. And Nixon was the other extreme, and so this kind of idea of this emphasis on these rather soft skills, when we talk about 21st century skills, how do you present, how do you, interact with people or what have you, all this is a de-emphasizing on what you know and how you can apply what you know. And I wonder if there is some correlation there. It's actually, not to get into politics, but
no, it's really disturbing, because we've spent several episodes talking about what assessment does to instruction and how it narrows the curriculum and does some really bad things, to what could be a really good teacher, because eventually the students want to know what's on the test, so you start teaching that. But the same thing, I think, applies to presentation. You're learning material only as much as you need to make that presentation, and then you're done. And right. Maybe there'll be a traditional test on top of it in the pure form of project-based learning. The project is the assessment. It's everything. It's all part of it. But that's another force to, I wouldn't say dumb down the curriculum, but narrow it in a way that, in the more, the pristine sense of teaching, we would want not necessarily take it there to how you present it. We want a student to be able to articulate it, but not standing up in a line, doing their PowerPoint slides, like you said, because that's not showing any knowledge.
And it goes to, I think we talked about this before. I hope not, because it's only episode 13. If we're starting to repeat ourselves, it's a bad sign. But was it Heidegger that said, what is easier to teach or to learn?
Right.
The more stuff gets put into the system, the more stuff that comes into the classroom, the less the kid is actually going to know or to learn about what it is you want them to learn. And so, and here's an example of it. You talk about the kid that knows how to do videos. What is he actually doing as a member of that group? Does he know as much as everyone else does? Possibly, but it could be at an equally low level.
Well, I was tempted to question students. I know you've done that, where your culminating presentation also includes taking questions from a really challenging teacher. And I don't see that a lot, and I've observed a lot of presentations that was part of what I did. And the question and answer was kind of superficial, perfunctory, nothing that would challenge anybody. And the whole purpose of that presentation and the Q&A was to avoid embarrassment in public.
Yeah, and we've read accounts, the idea that teachers in the United States are more inclined to bail their kids out of a potentially embarrassing situation rather than to place them in one. And I have a sense that I don't want the kid to be humiliated, but at the same time, God Almighty, if you're going to stand up in front of a classroom of people, and I try to tell them beforehand, when I was doing projects, I try to tell them beforehand. So listen, I'm going to question you. And I'm not going to question you as if you've had 3 years to work on this, but I'm going to question you. You should have some answers, or you should have some ideas. And inevitably, it never happened because they worked at such a shallow level, because you had the rubric, which I was supposed to have. I tried to make it innocuous. I tried to make it vague, but you had to have a rubric, and you had to have these guidelines, and you just walked away thinking these kids got nothing out of this project.
Looking at a rubric, to follow up on what you're saying, often there is something about the presentation itself, how the presenters look, how they handle themselves. Are they confident? Are they chewing gum or something silly might make it into the rubric? Are they eating nachos out loud so they're disturbing people? Who knows? It's easy to make fun of it. But think about work. There is the idea that a project, that's how work works, right?
Right.
There are projects that are real. They're not. You can't diminish their importance because it's not a grade. It's real life.
Right.
And so to take the other side a little bit, that employees need to know how to work with each other, to show leadership, to defer, to present something in a good way. So all this does apply, but at what cost? And I think that's kind of underlying what we're talking about. And the cost is the depth of the knowledge, even though these are really great skills to learn. There's nothing wrong with it, but that can't be the thing.
It can't be the thing, but also if you had a stricter process, those skills still come into play. If this thing is treated more seriously, if this thing is treated more of it with an educational paradigm rather than a show paradigm, you still have to be able to work with one another. You still have to be able to collaborate. Those things don't go away simply by ratcheting up what it is that you want the student to be able to produce at the end of the project. They still have to be able to show that. The question is the show really that important? Now, unfortunately, we have it. We have the show. You and I are both sports fans. We know what fake hustle is. The person who's running around looking like they're doing something, and then you get the person who's running around and actually doing something. And so, and it kind of makes me, it kind of reminds me of that. The idea of you drive for show, you putt for dough kind of a thing. That there's an element there of show, but ultimately that's not what's important. Ultimately, what's important is what can you achieve in the sporting arena, but in the classroom, what do you know should be the most important part of any kind of assessment.
Well, we've been kind of bashing project-based learning. I do have what I think is an example of a project that I did that I think worked. And
okay.
I taught a course in applied music, and applied music meant pretty much do whatever Herr Dr. Burgess wants to do. Sure. I am a musician and I am a pianist. The music you hear on the show is mine. I think I've never said that here. But I think for much of my teaching career, the teaching job was my day job, but I was really a musician who needed to support himself through teaching. But the course was really open. And so we happen to have a very good setup where we had practice rooms where I could put students in groups. And the structure of the class included listening. So they would listen in comments, so discussion of music, my stuff that I would present or that they would present. But the main project was simply a group performance with a deadline. And sometimes it meant composition. Sometimes it meant doing a cover song, something from, maybe do a Beatles song. And so these were musicians of different levels, but there was always somebody who could play keyboard, somebody who could play the guitar, somebody who could sing. So setting the groups was really important. And so it's kind of doing real project-based learning now. What are your areas? And I let the students pick the groups, and they didn't just pick their friends. I told them, you need to be kind to everybody and find out who can cover these parts.
Right.
So they would do that. And I would say, now you have 3 days to perform or to prepare, and then you're going to perform for the group. And so they would get in their rooms and work. I would walk around, and if they were working and doing what they needed to and engaged, I'd just keep walking. I'd never interrupt them. But you walk in, and
kind of the Montessori. It's kind of the Montessori idea. You never interrupt a kid learning.
That's right. That's right. And so they had a time limit, and it was real. The collaboration was real because they had something that they had to do publicly. They did evaluate each other, but it was really just a small part. I really never talked about grades at all. At the end, they ended up getting a very high grade, and if they met the requirements. But that was a project that the students not just enjoyed, but they actually followed through because they had a deadline and they needed each other to get it done. And what we said at the very beginning is that some areas lend themselves beautifully to that.
Right.
But probably not history, probably not German, probably not English to some extent, because these are you're reading subjects and projects don't fit as well as things that are more applied.
Yeah, I think with that caveat, it should be noted that our experiences or how we perceive, and to some degree, project-based learning, I think our criticisms are not criticisms necessarily of the idea in and of itself, but how it will ultimately unfold unless there are some very kind of strict guidelines about how you set it up and what it is that you're trying to achieve. And so I too want to kind of put the caveat there that what we're not talking about a damning of an entire, way in which you teach, but rather one, how we experienced it, and two, the potential pitfalls that will befall a school or an organization who tries to apply this in kind of a universal sense. I think with a lot of things, that there are certain students who have a strength towards something like this, who have a seriousness that we get the most out of it. And I think others, I don't know, I think others have a different mindset on what they want from their education, and a project may not necessarily be it.
Well, you're an AP teacher, advanced placement, which is a real serious exam at the end of the year that will give a student college credit if they pass. So there's so there's money involved for the parents. Actually, you want to get a 4 or 5. Some colleges take a 3, but that really matters. So you're starting out the school year, and you have a calendar, and you want to get to that test in May, and have as many students as possible pass it, get 4s and 5s. Would your first choice, as a history teacher, be, okay, I want to do as many projects as possible during this year? We need to do another project because we have some things to cover. Let's do a project.
Yeah, the problem is that, the AP curriculum is built for speed.
Right.
And so, any AP teacher out there will tell you that already from the onset, we feel like we don't have enough time to do what we have to do. And projects slow things down. Not because projects are somehow deficient, but for projects to be worth anything, they have to be longer in duration than just a day or a couple of days or even a week. I think I don't know if there is a good project less than a week time, because then the emphasis is more on the show, as you kind of referred to it earlier, than it is on the know. And I think that's the issue. And if I was in a different kind of class, if I had a little bit more of a luxurious pacing I could follow, then maybe you could consider something, and you what you do is you assess your kids, find out where the strengths are, and then you try to fit a project that kind of matches that. You know, your music kids were inherently interested in wanting to be musicians. They were inherently wanting to emote in a musical fashion, and so because of that, there was already a built-in level of buy-in by your students into the idea of the project that you put before them. And that's what we're saying. It has to be something that's specific to the group, that's specific to the class. And if any one of those things are out of line, it's not going to work. At least it didn't work for me. Maybe a better teacher could make something out of it, but I think there's some inherent flaws to it.
Well, it is put forth as a methodology, a complete methodology. The idea of being interdisciplinary is really important for project-based, but it is a complete method. And that's in all the literature about it. It's not something you tack on at the end. And I think in some cases, maybe in the case of our courses, it should be something that's tacked on at the end.
Mm-hmm.
You use it for what it is. But considering it across all subjects, the level of integration from teacher to teacher to make all curriculum, because we saw some examples of, I guess, science academies, where students would, I think that we had like a wing in Boeing of a jet they're building.
Right, inside of Seattle or something like that.
So. Yeah, that's right. And some internships, but to turn that into academics across all disciplines, I don't know if it's possible. I'm not. You'd have to do a lot of flips to make that happen, and I don't think anybody is that motivated to put the pieces together.
And I think the first red flag comes up when you say complete or total or all encompassing.
Right.
There's your first red flag. Because whether you're talking about history or mathematics or science or literature, you're talking about not just different disciplines, but different ways of thinking, different ways of producing what it is that you know. And so it is by nature a problematic square peg to fit into a round hole. Sometimes it'll work, like you said, in a scientific setting, or if in a mathematical setting, perhaps. But outside of that, you start running into trouble.
Well, the acronym for project-based learning is PBL.
Yes.
There's another method that's also called PBL, and it's problem-based learning. And to me, that's a little bit more exciting because it doesn't imply that that the students create an artifact, something physically that they build or some presentation. A problem-based learning could result in a research paper.
Right.
It may not need a group of students, but it could be individual. They wouldn't need to be dressed up and standing next to a PowerPoint. Right. So I think maybe they got the P wrong in the PBL. The problem seems much more interesting academically than the idea of producing something.
Because can you not say that all great advancements started with the identification of a problem? And you look through the whole course of history, you look at the desire to understand history, and it starts with a problem. How do we fix this problem? All learning, all exploration of knowledge, all contemplation of knowledge starts with the recognition that a problem exists. As far as like how we interact with something, how we see something, how we understand something, there's a problem that needs to be addressed. And perhaps, as you say, that might be a more interesting, exciting, thought-provoking way of enhancing or the way of doing education.
The other interesting thing about that is that for a student or a group of students to appreciate the nature and the importance of a problem, they need a lot of background, which means they need to read, they need teaching, they need discussion. The problem comes later. You can't just start out and say, this is the problem you're going to address, because they have nothing to attach it to.
Right.
But in a way, problem-based learning aligns better with classical methodology. It aligns more with what we think should happen in the classroom, which is a lot of reading and a lot of discussion, and not a lot of time. I'm not going to say wasted. I almost did.
Yeah.
But, creating things that maybe aren't the best use of time. And let's face it, students learn to use technology with or without us.
Right.
It's not like they need to learn how to do, make videos.
Right.
Or
they're doing it already.
Yeah. Oh, let's do PowerPoint. I mean, we were doing this when PowerPoint was relatively new.
Right.
So everybody had spinning text on almost each letter and stop already, and then they had Prezi. Remember that?
Yeah.
Where things come flying in. I would actually get a headache. I would start looking at the ceiling because if I looked at it, I couldn't do it. But
it's like Santana in his later years, where he just started putting flurs of guitar strokes, in every pause and silence. It was gilding the lily at some point. It's just, you can't do it. So
yeah, we can't have that. So it's really taken us down a dark road if we think about it. We're trying to create order out of this chaos,
Right.
And that's so the method touched a nerve with us.
Yes.
And I wish the faculty meetings that we attended were really good conversations, but we had a little bit of pushback.
A little,
yeah, because there were true believers in
Yes.
there, but also the thing is, there were teachers who had subjects that aligned really well with the methodology, and there are others that didn't, and so we kind of picked sides based upon our own needs as teachers.
Well, just an idea, just about one aspect of something that is out there that people are professing. Again, our criticisms are not of the system in and of itself, but how it could potentially unfold depending upon the circumstances in which it is applied. But just yet another thing that's down the pike, and maybe what is old is new again. And here we go again, as far as like how we do things. But and we'll be doing these kind of classes here, kind of podcasts, as we go through, kind of highlighting some of these other ideas. But it's kind of fun to kind of revisit this notion, project-based learning.
Yeah, I think it's fun. I think we're a little out of date. I think it's already had its hearing.
Yes.
Maybe it's less in fashion than it was. So we're, beating a dead horse, but we do that.
We've been known to. That's true. So anyway, well, the Herr Dr. Bourgeois, I trust that you will have a great week. I trust our listeners will have a great week. And perhaps we say good night, Herr Dr. Bourgeois.
Yes, indeed. Good night, Herr Miller.